I haven't done a mini lecture in a while, but today I want to talk a little bit about Reconstruction. Reconstruction is often seen as the period after the war, but really Reconstruction starts during the war. As we well know, by 1863, if not earlier, the Union had already started to occupy areas of the South. I mean, certainly you saw that even as early as 1861, 62 with the Contraband Plan. The Union Army was coming in contact with Southern civilians, was taking over Southern territory. The question was going to be how to administer those territories. Today, we often see the United States Army as a peacekeeping force, somebody who could administer civilian governments. Back in the 19th century, the Army was really built just to destroy things, to win a war. It was not designed to be a social or political or an economic organization. Basically, the idea was that the South needed to be reconstructed. Reconstruction is generally divided into two periods. 1863 to 1867, so again, starting 2 years before the war ended, which is presidential Reconstruction, and 1867 to 1876, which is either radical or congressional Reconstruction. And when we look at Reconstruction, there are a couple issues that come to mind. First of all, what should happen to the former Confederate states and to former Confederates? We tend to forget about this issue, but you think about it. Southerners had seceded from the Union. Maybe the Union had said they couldn't secede or legally couldn't secede, but there were some people who said, you know what? These states have disappeared. We should adopt a scorched earth policy. We should reconstitute them as territories. What about ex-Confederates? What about if you took up a gun against the United States? Should all white Southerners be automatically pardoned? Should it matter what rank you were, or maybe allow privates to be okay, but maybe generals and up or captains and up to be punished? What about plantation owners? Should they lose their property in terms of their land? So the idea is sort of how much consequence there should be to fighting a war against the federal government. And the reason we tend to forget this question is we know that Florida was a state in 1860 and Florida is a state again in 1870 with the same borders. We know that white Southerners didn't lose their right to vote, but it was really a question that still could have existed in 1863, 64, really throughout Reconstruction. The question we folk tend to focus on is what should happen to the former slaves. Now, that was obviously a very important question as well, and probably the fundamental question of Reconstruction. Now, we say former slaves because by 1863, we've had the Emancipation Proclamation. By 1865, we will have the 13th Amendment of the Constitution, which ends slavery. But being free is not being equal. There's a prominent book written on Reconstruction called Nothing But Freedom, and the title is somewhat ironic because, of course, we would say freedom could possibly be everything. But freedom is not necessarily everything. Freedom does not mean equality. You can be free, but we talk about level the playing field today. I mean, they're still talking about reparations for people whose ancestors were slaves. But forget about today. What about back then? Do former slaves, should they get any sort of economic compensation? There was some discussion of dividing up the master's plantations and giving it to the slaves who had worked there on those plantations. Does freedom involve sort of, so in that case, economic justice, let's say? What about political rights? What about social rights? Do African Americans have the right to enter into restaurants, conceivably? Do they have the right to vote? And these are the questions that Reconstruction will ultimately try to determine the results from. It's an incomplete grade, I think you would give Reconstruction. A lot of people call the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s the second Reconstruction because in many ways it's trying to fulfill the sort of goals of perhaps the first Reconstruction. So Reconstruction starts in 1863. This map I've already showed you, I'll show you again. This sort of gives a sense of the states that were reconstructed. There are two dates on each of the states. So let's take Florida. I think it's 1868, 1877. The two dates on this map are when the state is formally admitted back into the Union. So again, it doesn't happen right away in 1865. In fact, I'm not even sure what the earliest date is on here, probably 1866 in Tennessee. And when it is restored to democratic rule. So when the Republicans who have taken over have allowed African American voting rights and civil rights when they disappear from the South. Well, the first date on here is 1866. I said Reconstruction actually starts earlier. Lincoln, presidential Reconstruction, so Lincoln's the president in 1863, starts presidential Reconstruction in Louisiana. By 1863 in Louisiana, New Orleans was captured in April of 1862. The Mississippi River, with the fall of Vicksburg in July of 1863, is open. And the majority then of Louisiana's population is under Union control. Probably New Orleans represented almost 25% of the population of the state by itself. So Lincoln proposes in 1863 something that comes to be known as the 10% plan. And the 10% plan is a pretty lenient Reconstruction plan. It says you take the number of votes cast in the 1860 presidential election. So in Louisiana, they cast approximately 60,000 votes in the presidential election of 1860. 60,000 times 0.1, 10% of 60,000 is 6,000. If 6,000 Louisianans will sign an oath to adhere to the federal government, to voluntarily be reconstructed, they can write a state constitution. That state constitution has to end slavery, and the state will be readmitted to the Union. Whoa, that's not much of a requirement at all right there. So Louisiana 1864 sits down a all-white state constitution, writes a new state constitution, ends slavery. But that's it. There's no discussion of social rights, no discussion of political rights. Abraham Lincoln writes a letter where he says to the new governor of Louisiana, he quotes, barely suggests that they allow certain African Americans, particularly veterans of the Union Army, to vote. Maybe some wealthy free Africans of color who lived in, free people of color as they would call them, who lived in Louisiana before the war. Maybe allow them to vote. And Louisiana rejects that. However, when it meets in 1863 and 1864, this Constitutional Convention, there's an interesting side note. The Constitution itself, it's in a meeting, formal meeting, Robert's Rules of Order. At the end of those meetings, somebody bangs a gavel and the meeting adjourns. Well, this 1864 convention doesn't actually adjourn. It just sort of disappears. People don't come back, but it never officially adjourns. That will become important 2 years later. So Lincoln puts together this lenient plan, and there are some people in the North who are critical of this lenient plan. Congress has no intention of allowing Lincoln simply to do the plan. Congress pushes something called the Wade-Davis bill, which does not pass, does not become law. In 1864, Senators Wade and Davis proposed that for a state to be readmitted to the Union, a majority must take the ironclad oath. This would be almost impossible. This would say that the majority of a southern state would have to say that they are loyal to the Union, never took up arms against the Union. They must abolish slavery. Okay, Lincoln would agree with that. Must reject the Confederate debt. This becomes a big issue after the Civil War. If Georgia assumes a debt to fight against the United States government, does the United States government have the obligation to help pay that debt? The Wade-Davis bill would say no. Technically, the 14th Amendment will also say no to that. Must deny political rights to Confederate officers and political officials. This will ultimately, there'll be some discussion of this in presidential Reconstruction, but the Wade-Davis bill is seen as too harsh. Well, why does Lincoln see these bills as too harsh? Remember, in 1863, the war isn't over yet. Lincoln's trying to coax the rest of the South back into the Union, ideally before the 1864 presidential election and the war. So he wants to make Reconstruction fairly lenient, I think, in 1863. Now, Lincoln said that he would consider making Reconstruction, consider making changes. And Lincoln's frustrated by the lack of Reconstruction. You could argue the lack of sort of a sense that the South is losing the war in Louisiana's Reconstruction, which gives very few political rights to African Americans. But he's worried. If he makes this a harsh war that says we're going to destroy all the plantations, seize all the property, well, then the South might fight even harder. Now, in presidential Reconstruction, Lincoln seems to be answering the question. Congress would also seem to be answering the question. And here we have, of course, this is where slavery will officially end, the 13th Amendment. Interesting to note, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude except as punishment of crime. You often hear of convict leasing after the Civil War, after Reconstruction in the South. This is really basically allowing convict leasing to occur that you can have. But clearly the 13th Amendment passed in 1865 does end slavery. So there are other people, of course, who want to answer these questions. Lincoln might have his view. Republican congressmen might have their view. Democratic congressmen and senators might have their view. African Americans also have their view. And their view is that they want to have social and political rights in this new nation. They want to have economic rights. While white Southerners might say that seizing property, seizing plantations is taking away people's rights unconstitutionally, African Americans will point out they've worked on these plantations for years and years, sometimes generations and generations, and they haven't been compensated. So perhaps they should get their compensation in land. African Americans wanted social rights, they wanted political rights, particularly voting rights, they wanted economic help from the federal government or from sort of Confederates, I guess you could argue, from Southerners. They wanted to seize Southern land and give it to African Americans. African Americans, however, don't have, they're at the table, I guess, theoretically, by 1870. African Americans will have the right to vote, but they're certainly not the powers in terms of getting that right to vote. African Americans also recognize that to get these equal rights, they wanted to be allowed to fight in the army, which of course comes up. We've talked about that, or you've read about that in your exams. Also, they want to have education, and a lot of that happens after the Civil War. You have a lot of African Americans either starting school, white Northerners come down, missionaries come down and start school, white African American churches start schools, state governments form schools to allow for education. There's very little actual land seizure and land redistribution. Sometimes you hear about the famous 40 acres and a mule. 40 acres and a mule associated with William Tecumseh Sherman, his special order number 15. William Tecumseh Sherman will march to Atlanta, burn Atlanta, and then march to the sea. Subsequently, he'll march from the sea up from Savannah through South Carolina into North Carolina. As he marched, thousands of African Americans followed him. William Tecumseh Sherman is no racial liberal. He's no abolitionist. And in fact, he's frustrated that African Americans are slowing him down. So what he does is in the Sea Islands of South Carolina, he says, you stay here and we'll give you land. So he issues special order number 15, promises African Americans 40 acres. Subsequently, later legislation will talk about farm animals, including mules. So you get this phrase of 40 acres and a mule. And so here you have a non-abolitionist making one of the most powerful statements, allowing African American families to seize land from prominent planters, prominent rice plantations down in the coast of South Carolina. Ultimately, unfortunately, 2 years later, most of this land will be redistributed back to its owners. But it does represent this brief time period where you have some discussion of land seizure. Lincoln will set Reconstruction policy from 1863 to 1865. In March of 1865, he has his second inaugural address. He makes a prominent speech. His last speech he actually makes in April of 1865 talks about abolition. And he says, you know what I've done in Louisiana with this 10% plan might not be the end all. There's going to be a new Reconstruction announcement. I can change the terms of Reconstruction. And at this point, the war seems to be ending. Lincoln's evolves on a lot of issues. You think about it, he evolves on slavery over time. And it seems pretty clear that Lincoln's going to evolve the issue on Reconstruction, maybe make a harsher Reconstruction. But before he can do that, Lincoln, of course, famously goes to Ford's Theater on Good Friday, and John Wilkes Booth, a Maryland Southern sympathizer, assassinates Abraham Lincoln. And with the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, presidential Reconstruction will turn from being a Lincoln-sponsored endeavor to an Andrew Johnson-sponsored endeavor. My next mini lecture will talk about who Andrew Johnson is and how he comes to terms, or really comes to blows, you could argue, with Congress over presidential Reconstruction.